What's up, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Kev the Dev. We're in the From Zero to Continuous Delivery web series. And this video, we're going to be pushing our web app to EC2 in AWS. And we're going to deploy our application to the cloud. So this is going to be exciting because you're going to take your code that you've been seeing running on your local, and we're going to push it to the cloud, and you're going to see it running from a cloud server. You're going to be able to access it from anywhere. And yeah, so without further ado, let's get going. You know what we're about to do. Oh yeah. Small Kev the Dev. All right, people. Let's get started. So we left off last video with our application, our sales JavaScript application running locally. And what I want to start with in this video first is to run the application in production mode. Before we deploy to the cloud, you want to kind of be aware of what your application is doing when it serves its assets, because you want to make some optimizations for when you're deploying a web application to the cloud. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So go to your directory where you have the sales JavaScript application or whatever. And if you are building your own application and pushing it to production and you're not following along with us, that's fine. Maybe skip this step and I'll put a timestamp for when we actually are pushing up to AWS. Okay, so when we ran our application before, we used a simple command, sales lift. And that starts up the application on your local. It serves it from the 1337 port and lets us access it through localhost 1337. Now, that works great. Now, if we look, though, at the network tab, so if you do Control-Shift-I, or if you're on Mac, Command-Option-I, you can open up the browser's tab, the developer tools, open up the network tab, and then hit a refresh on this page. You'll see that each script and style sheet, the CSS files and JS files, they are loaded individually. And that's fine when you're the only one interacting with your server, but that's a lot of web requests to the server. So what the typical path forward for a production server is we combine all those scripts and style sheets into one file. They call it a minified file, and we serve that single file. So in order to do that, we need to tell our node server that we are in production mode, and then sales.js is actually going to do that minification for us. So what we're going to do is say to deploy this application, but we're going to use the production environment. Now, it's not going to work right away, but let's try it. So go back, Control-C, and we'll type in sales lift. We'll do -- prod. So that's going to attempt to start the application in production mode, but it's not going to succeed, and it's going to tell us why. If we scroll up, we'll see that there's an error message that says that there's nothing set for only allow origins or before connect in the sockets, and for security reasons, you have to set one of them. So we're just going to kind of follow those instructions. We're going to open up our text editor. We're going to go over to the file that it's talking about, which is in the config environment production file. So here we are, and we're going to find the has been modified, save changes. No. Okay. So we are going to find the section that it's talking about, which is sales config sockets only allow origins. So we are going to I'm going to do a quick Command F for only allow origins. Here it is. Now it has it commented out for us. So let's just go ahead and uncomment that out. And this is basically saying what is allowed to make connections from the web browser back to the web server to open up a WebSocket, which is pretty technical, but we want to whitelist the domain that the application is running on. And so currently that's localhost. So we want to make sure that localhost is here. So just go ahead and do localhost. So now if we try to do sales lift with prod, it should work. All right, so we did sales lift prod after touching the only allow origins, and we see that it stood up fine. It's listening on the same port, 1337. Now when we do a request, let's watch this network tab again, okay? So refresh. And it rerouted us to example.com, which is not quite what we expected. But it is the expected behavior based on this configuration file. So if we scroll down to the bottom of this production config file, we'll see something called the base URL. This overrides the default behavior and sets the base URL of our application to whatever is here. So what happened was we went to our server, it got there correctly, but then the sales.js did a redirect on what our base URL was. And that's not, that's not really what we want. So let's go ahead and again, we're going to set our URL to be what it's going to be served from, which again, temporarily is going to be localhost. So let's do that. We're going to stop the server. We'll restart it and see what happens. So you can see that when we overrode the base URL to be localhost, it was able to get there correctly this time. And I also want you to notice something else. The assets in this page are significantly fewer, right? There are way less files that are being retrieved. You'll notice that there are a couple ones that I want you to take note of. Production.min.js, production.min.css. Those are the minified files that I was talking about, and that's what you want to see in a production-like service. Great. Okay, we've now run the service locally, but in production mode. How do we get this deployed to AWS in an EC2 server? Let's find out. All right, so first thing that we're going to need is an AWS account. So if you don't already have one, go to console.aws.amazon.com and create an account with your email and your password. After making an account and signing in, and I'll include links to some getting started guides to AWS in the description, but if you have already read those and you kind of know where to go, then we can keep going here. We're only going to be focusing on one service right now, and that's EC2. So if you go to services, you'll see that in the list under compute, the first one is EC2, which is just fancy for Elastic Cloud Compute. And what we're going to do is we're going to make an instance. There's like 5 different ways to do that from this page, but we're just going to use the one that's right in front of us, launch instance. So we're going to click that and do launch instance, just plain. And we're going to choose the Amazon Linux 2 AMI. I'm filming this in 2020, so if they've added a new AMI, then I'll link to a new video on how to do this. But for now, choose Amazon Linux 2 AMI. And there are a lot of different types of servers that you can launch, and they cost a varying amount of money per hour that they are up. Again, a link to the different pricing of the different tiers in the description. The one that we're going to focus on, though, is the cheapest one. We're going to use a T3 Nano. So look down the page just a little bit, and you'll see the T3A Nano. That is one of the cheapest types of EC2 instances that you can provision. And since we're just doing a simple web app, we don't need a lot of scaling, a lot of compute power. At this time, we're going to start with the cheapest and smallest one. So we're going to choose that instance type, T3A Nano, and we are going to configure instance details. We're going to check this. We don't need to do any of this here right now. If you are interested, I encourage you to look into some of the more advanced configuration settings that you can do. Maybe you want to use a spot instance to get a little bit of a cheaper price. There are some things here that you can configure to make it more suit your needs, but we're just going to leave it all default because we don't have to mess with it right now. So we're going to review and launch. Okay, so I might have glossed over something earlier, and that was the free tier. I've had an Amazon account for a long time, so I don't have access to free tier. But if you are just making a brand new Amazon account, then you actually have access to a free tier of instance types, which I believe is the T2 Micro. If we go back to previous. Yeah, so the T2 Micro is free tier eligible. Feel free to use that, which I believe you get a certain amount of time. You can see in the description here of free, and that lets you kind of play around with it. If you don't have free tier eligible, like you've already used it, your eligibility, then I would go with the cheaper T3A Nano. So choose T2 Micro if this is a new account. Choose T3 Nano if this is an old account. So we'll go back, click review and launch. Okay, so next step, we're going to launch the instance. So we'll hit launch down here in the bottom right. This is where we can start to configure how we interact with our server. So what this is asking, we need a way to SSH into the server. So if you have a new account, then I'm going to go forward as if I don't have an existing key pair. We need to create a key pair that allows our computer to authenticate with the EC2 instance. So instead of choosing an existing key pair, I'm going to create a new key pair. Name it whatever you want. I'll do Kev the dev, and I'm going to download key pair. It's going to save it. I'll just do it to my desktop, Kev the dev. And what that's going to do is it's going to launch an instance with the public key of that key pair. And that's going to be the only way that you can SSH into the instance. And I'll show you how to do that. So hit launch instances. And this is going to take a couple of minutes. But if you hit view instances, we can see that the instance is now in our EC2 instances section. It says it's pending. And I'm going to come back when it is running. And as I looked back at the camera, it's already started running. So that was fast. So what we're going to do now is SSH into it. And before we do that, let's make sure that we can. So Amazon has this idea of security groups, which is their way of enforcing who and what are allowed to SSH or interact with our servers through any ports and through any protocols. Right now, out of the box, the instance comes with the default Launch Wizard security group, which actually allows you port 22 access from any IP address through the TCP protocol, which for us is great. That's what we need right now. That is the SSH protocol. So as long as that's there, we know that we're going to be able to SSH in. So let's go back to the details tab here. The public IP address is what we want. So we're going to copy that IP address, and let's go ahead and cancel our sales application. All right, so I am going to SSH into the EC2 instance using that key pair that I just made and downloaded to a location that I remember. And we do that by doing SSH-I, which is telling it where we have our key. So my key is located on the desktop, and I believe it's Kev the dev, PEM. All right, so now we need to do our IP address. All EC2 instances, their default user that you SSH in as is called EC2 user. So we're going to do EC2-user @ and we'll paste that IP address. So this should be all we need to get into the box. So hit enter, and it's going to ask, are we sure? Yes, I'm sure. There we are. Boom. We have now successfully SSH'd into a running instance in the cloud. Okay, great. What do we do while we're here? Again, if we're just trying to get a web server up and running, we only need to install a few things. If you're not using the Node application that I'm using, then you might have to install a few other things. But for the Node users, all we need to install are Node and Git. All right, so first thing we're going to do is install Node. Now, in order to install Node on an EC2 instance, you need to curl an endpoint that actually has a shell script that can be run. I'll include the link in the description to the instructions on how to do that. So here's that webpage that I'll link in the description. So first thing we need to do is paste this curl, which again is just going to reach out and download a script and run it. Then we're going to activate Node Version Manager. And lastly, we will use Node Version Manager to install Node. Now the Node version that I had on my local is different than the Node version that it by default downloads here, which is 14.3.1. So I'm just going to go ahead and install 12.1.8.4, which that's what I was using on my local. That might not be required, but that's what I'm going to do. So nvm install. Okay, so that's going to use 12.18.4. All right, so now if we do node-v, we should see 12.18.4 is the default version. All right, so now that we have Node installed, we will also have npm installed. Because we installed Node, we should also have npm. There it is. So what we need to do next is get our code from the repository that we saved it to and run npm install so that we can get all the dependencies that we need. But our EC2 instance doesn't come with git installed. We type git not found. So all we need to do is use the built-in package manager yum and execute sudo yum install git, and -y is going to say yes to any of the prompts that it asks for. So once git is installed, then we will be able to clone our repository. All right, so go to your GitHub page, wherever you're storing your code, and copy the SSH link to clone the repository. And so if we try to clone it, let's do git clone, and I'll paste the endpoint. Yes, I want to continue. It's not going to work. And that's because we haven't configured the SSH key on our EC2 instance yet. Now, if you recall from the last video, we set up an SSH key on our local to communicate with GitHub. So we have to do the same thing, but for the EC2 instance. So we do it the same way. We use SSH keygen to make a key on our EC2 instance, copy the public key, and paste it in GitHub, and that will connect the dots and let us clone and push if we wanted to. So we're going to do SSH keygen -t for type. We're going to do ed25519 for the elastic no password, no passphrase. Yep, there it is. For the ECDSA type of curve. And we're going to cat out the public key. We can see that there is the ID, here it is, .pub. So this is what we're going to copy and paste into GitHub that will allow us to communicate with GitHub from the EC2 instance. So we will copy all of that. And you're going to go into your GitHub's settings page, go to SSH. We're going to add a new key. We'll paste that key, and I'll just title this one EC2. It's asking me for my password, so I'll just go ahead and use my password manager. There we go. You can see here we have an EC2 SSH key. So we don't have to do anything else on the EC2 side. All we have to do now is retry the clone command, and it should work just fine there. There it is. If we do an ls, we should see sales sample app. Great. We should be able to cd into that new directory, look at all the files, and there we are. Okay, so we now have all the code on our instance. We have Git, we have Node, but we don't have all of our dependencies just yet. We need to run npm install, which will take a look at our package JSON and npm install, and it will download all the dependencies that it needs to run the application, like Express, sales, etc. Okay, once it's done, we can do, let's try this. Let's try a sales lift. Oh, sales not found. That's because sales needs to be installed globally. npm install sales-g for global. Sales needs to be installed globally in order for us to use it like a command in that fashion. All right, so sales is now installed globally, so what we can do is sales lift, just like we did locally. Now, we're not doing it in production mode. You can see environment is development, but we, in theory, should be able to use our dashboard, look at the instance, and just try and connect to it. So we're just going to copy that IP address. We can see it's running on port 1337. If we paste that in here and try and, whoops. If we paste the IP address and we do, 1337, it is not going to work. You think it would, but it's not quite there yet. That's because we don't have the traffic open and unblocked from getting through that port to our instance. So if we go back to security on our instance, we'll see that the inbound rules only allow traffic from 22, which is SSH. So what we need to do is open that up to traffic on port 1337. Okay, so now before we can actually add the security groups to the instance, we have to make them. So we're going to go to security groups over here, and I've got a few, but I'll make them with you right now. So hit create security group. We can call it web traffic, and we can say that it allows web traffic. We'll leave it as the default VPC, and we're going to add an inbound rule. So this is where we can specify what kind of traffic we want to let in. Now we could do custom TCP and put the port in here manually, but they also have a nice convenient HTTP rule that will let us choose 80. We can say from anywhere and add the rule. Or that was already adding the rule. So we'll also go ahead and add a custom TCP that will allow traffic on port 1337, because right now that's what the server is listening on. And again, we'll do from anywhere. Now you do not need to add a corresponding outbound rule, because anytime that you have an inbound rule on port 80 or an inbound rule on port anything, the security group will allow traffic to flow back out from the web server to your machine. So you don't need to add it. You don't need to specify an outbound rule here. So we'll go ahead and create this security group. So now you can see that we have traffic allowing port 80 and 1337 through to our web server. So now let's attach that. So we're going to go back to our instances. We'll make sure that it's checked. We'll go to Actions, Networking, and change security groups. So now we're just going to type in web traffic and add security group. So if we save that, what we'll see is now, in addition to the SSH rule of port 22, we'll also see the web traffic rule. So if we go back to instances, go to security on our instance, we'll see the port 22 is there and all the other ports that we need to be open. Okay, so our web server is still running. If we try now to access, let's see, I need that copy and paste. The details, public IP address, yes. Okay, so now by typing in the address and the 1337, we should be able to hit our web server. So there we go. We can see all of the assets were requested and successfully retrieved. But again, we're not in production mode, back to the beginning of our video. So now we want to take what we've just done and deploy in production mode on our web server so that we get our assets in a more condensed fashion that minimizes traffic on the web server, because each of these files is an individual request on our server. You can see that if we go back here, status 200, these are individual network requests, which can really add up. So we want to minimize that to be the minimum amount. But we can't just do sales lift productions, because if you recall, we did a few things in our configuration file earlier that let it work in production mode. So we needed to do that for the cloud. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to our instances page and copy that IP address. That's critical. That's the first thing. Next thing is, let's modify our code here. So we need to change our base URL, just like last time, to be whatever it's going to be served from. So let's go ahead and paste our IP address in there, and we will make sure that our WebSocket connection can be established. So we'll override localhost to be that one. So after we've made those changes, we will just need to push those up to Git and then download them on our instance side. So I have a separate window here, which is our local machine. So I've got the view. Let's see, what's the git diff say? Shows yes, we changed it to be allow origins and the base URL. And then this is a modification that the asset pipeline of sales.js did for us that I don't care about. So I'm actually going to git checkout views and star. Good. So the only change that we want to save is the production one. So if you missed what I just did, I unchanged the views, layouts, layout.ejs page because it doesn't really matter a whole lot, honestly. So if you're having trouble with this, don't worry about it. But the point is, I don't want to save any of the changes that sales.js did for me under the hood. So I'm just going to go ahead and do git checkout, and which lets you reset the file. So I only should have one file change now, which is the production configuration file. So we're going to stage that to commit. So we're going to use the built-in inline message tool. So we'll do git commit-m. That's for the message. And we're going to say update prod config for EC2. All right. So we will now push that to origin main. And so now on our instance, we can go ahead and kill our development server, and we can do a git status up here. We're now back on EC2. Nothing to commit, so we'll do a pull. That should pull in the changes from production that we just did. So now if we try to do a sales lift with a prod switch, let's see what happens. It pushes it to production node env. It's now attempting to minify all of those assets that I mentioned earlier. Great, now we can see that the server's up and running. Environment is now production, port 1337. So let's try and go back here, and we'll refresh this page. And there we go. So now we have all of our assets in production minified mode, and we have it stood up in production. And if we want to see what the weather is in Las Vegas, there you go. Okay, so that was how we managed to deploy our app to production in EC2. But there's one piece left. So if you actually tried to exit out of your SSH session while the server was running, it would kill the server, which isn't really what we want. We want it to be running all the time, right? So what we can do is use, there are many different ways to do this, and we'll go over a more robust way to do this and a more generic way to do this in a different later video. But for now, a more node-specific way that we can do this is using a tool called Forever, which is a node tool that lets us, it's an NPM package which lets us start a process, and it will even restart the process if the server crashes. So what we'll want to do is do npm install forever, and we're going to do that globally. So -g. All right, so after we've done npm install -g forever, what we're going to want to do is run the application using this forever tool. And we have to run it a little bit differently than we did using sales lift. But before we do that, we actually need to set an environment variable in our EC2 instance that tells Node that it's production. You know, before we were doing sales lift -- prod, but in order to utilize this forever tool, we actually can't do it this way. So what we need to do is forever start app.js, but we're not going to run that yet. That is going to start a forever process using the application .js file that we have, which is going to start the sales app, but it's not going to start it in production mode unless we export a node_env equals production. So if we do that, what that's going to do is it sets a variable in the environment of the EC2 instance node_env, and it sets it to production. That now, if we type forever start app.js, this is going to pick up the environment variable that we just set, and it's actually going to start the application in production mode, just like we did before. Now, we'll wait a few seconds here before trying to hit our EC2 instance again, but when we do, we should find that it will return our website to us, and it will return the minified assets. So I'll just keep refreshing until the web server comes up behind the scenes. There it is. So now when we refresh, we can see that the web server is running. It's running even though it's not showing us on the terminal, and it's running in production mode. We can see our minified assets. Okay, great. So you managed to deploy an application to the cloud using Node, using EC2, using Amazon, and now we could exit out of our SSH session here if we type exit. We're not even in the we've closed the connection. We're not even in the server anymore, and we should be able to continue refreshing the page because the forever command is running behind the scenes. So let's do one more neat thing to kind of see the impact of our application on the server. If we go to monitoring on the instances page, we're actually going to be able to see a little sneak peek of the utilization of our resources. So we'll be able to see how much of our virtual computer that we're using, how much of our RAM, how much of the network traffic that we're allotted is being used, and sort of what is going on. What's a high-level picture of the performance of our application? And this is a really useful page as you're building a business or you're just building your site and you're trying to see the impact of a bunch of different requests on your website. And over the course of the series, this will become more and more critical, as you'll find out, as it's used to determine whether or not we need to scale and build more application copies to support additional load. So we'll get into that in a future video. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. Next video is going to be a quick one. We're going to talk about how to use a custom domain name so that once you've run your application, you don't have to type in the IP address every time. And we'll use a couple of different tools to get a domain name, register it, and get it set up so that everything's pointing to the right place. So feel free to check out the next video when that's up shortly. And thank you again for watching and joining me on our journey from zero to continuous delivery. I'll see y'all next time.